Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, as I now want to sort of look at last night's game between the Chiefs and the Ravens from a fantasy football perspective and talk about what is to be expected from a lot of the key skill position players that we saw last night. But we're going to start very quickly here at the quarterback position. Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, both of them are pretty much must starts for just about every game they could possibly play in. I do think it's of course notable that Lamar Jackson, there were definitely some concerns about what is the rushing outlook going to look like for him now that he is splitting attempts with Derrick Henry in that same backfield. Clearly, there shouldn't be all that much of a worry. Now, that being said, I thought that the red zone possession on the first drive was sort of a prime example of the fact that when it gets down to that, especially early on in the year, I do believe the Ravens are going to try and lean on Derrick Henry a little bit more. We saw Lamar last night with 16 rush attempts. That's great. He was very effective, 122 yards, but he's also your quarterback, and it can get a little bit risky if you lean on that too heavily. So ultimately, I think they're going to try and at least somewhat reduce the overall workload for Lamar, but he's still going to have his opportunities. He's Lamar Jackson. His legs are the ultimate weapon. Last night, if you watched the game, you probably saw that he became the third all-time leading rusher as a quarterback. So, that's never not going to be a part of his game. That shouldn't have to worry about Lamar, but at least worth noting that I do think red zone touches are going to be a little bit more in favor of Derrick Henry, especially considering the fact that they aren't necessarily using him on passing downs anyways. So you just went out, you made this splash move that a lot of people are excited about. They're going to want to show off their new toy a little bit in Derrick Henry. But additionally, on the other side here, Patrick Mahomes wasn't a great performance from him overall. The stats for him were slightly underwhelming. I believe in standard scoring leagues, he was somewhere from 15 to 16 points that he ultimately scored. The interception was pretty bad for him. Not totally sure what went on there. He was getting hit as he threw a little bit, but that was still way off, way short. Was a pretty impressive play from Roquan Smith to be able to go down, turn his body, and stay under that thing. So, give Roquan his credit there. But that being said, Mahomes overall in this game, 20 of 28, 291 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. It's not like he was incredible in this game, but I also think that what we talked about in the first segment as well, there's a number of new weapons in Kansas City, and I think that their offense is going to be much more functional this upcoming season than what we saw last year, where they led the NFL in drops. I don't think that's going to be the case. It's only going to get better, or easier, I should say, for Mahomes once Hollywood Brown comes back from injury as well, currently nursing a shoulder injury. Don't have an exact timeline yet on that, but I think that Patrick Mahomes is going to be just fine. But outside of that, again, we talked about Derrick Henry already, and he's not going to be a carry-heavy guy. He's definitely going to split the overall snaps with Justice Hill, maybe a little bit more than at least I initially anticipated on those passing downs. But I think that he's going to make his money's worth in the red zone to make it worth it. That there's a good chance, and as an owner of Derrick Henry myself in one of my fantasy leagues, I took him in the second round. Feels like that could have been possibly a little bit of a reach. It was late second round. But that being said, I think he can be a consistent 10-point per game running back. But that also being said, he could be touchdown reliant for his overall fantasy output. So we will definitely be keeping an eye on Derrick Henry. But really the bigger question, I would say, on the Baltimore side of the ball is what do we do with these tight ends? Just yesterday, I talked about how I am skeptical about the idea of really rolling with either one of Baltimore's tight ends in Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely, because at this point, Likely is sort of the up-and-coming option for them, but the Ravens are also in win-now mode, so it's not like trying to develop Likely is at the top of their priority list at this moment in particular. And also additionally with that, Likely and Andrews both have 2 years left on their contract, so I'm sure the Ravens are going to try and take advantage of both of them moving forward. So this ends up being a huge game for Likely. 9 receptions, 111 yards, and a touchdown. Obviously, we know he could have had another touchdown in there as well, but I mean, a great debut to his 2024 campaign. We saw Likely really step up while Mark Andrews was dealing with his injury last year. That it does feel like this could be a slight changing of the guard moment. Mark Andrews did not look his best by any means last night. I'm not fully just abandoning him now and saying that he's no good anymore. He's still 28 years old. It's not like Mark Andrews is an old man. Now, he's overcoming a couple significant injuries, not just the one that he suffered last year against the Bengals, I believe it was, but also the fact that he was in a car crash just a couple months ago during the offseason as well. So we could see a slow start to the season from him. I was already, like I mentioned, skeptical about starting either tight end moving forward for the most part, but it does definitely feel like we could be headed towards a little bit more of an Isaiah Likely-centric passing game. And the other part to this whole conversation as well is the fact that it's not like the Ravens are extremely deep in terms of pass catchers. Zay Flowers is somebody that they absolutely made it an effort to prioritize him and get him his touches. He had a couple carries along the way, along with an additional 10 targets in the passing game itself. So he will definitely be expected to be prominent for the Ravens this upcoming season. A great sign for fantasy football owners. We mentioned this yesterday on the show. I sort of wish I went on some sort of prop bet for Zay Flowers, but considering the fact that last year the low point of his season was in that AFC Championship game when he fumbled out of the end zone, that it should have been a little bit of a given that Todd Monken was going to try and force feed Flowers a little bit to build up his confidence for the upcoming season. And, you know, I just mentioned that for the sake that I think there was probably even an extra emphasis on Zay Flowers in this game. And, 12 touches, or ultimately ended up being 8 because there were 4 targets that weren't caught. But, 12 intended targets for him, 12 intended touches, I should say, is maybe a little bit high for him to expect that every single week. But that being said, he's the clear number 1 wide receiver there. You should feel good about his fantasy value, and how that relates to Isaiah Likely and Mark Andrews is but with the fact that it's not like there are other wide receivers really getting in the mix that are further taking away from Andrews and Likely. Outside of Zay Flowers, it was Justice Hill that was, the other non-tight end receiving threat for them, where, Rashad Bateman, 2 catches, 53 yards, had excellent play that I feel like is going to be a little bit overlooked because of what preceded, but I thought that was a great job from Bateman to high point the ball down the right sideline on that final drive for Baltimore. So wanted to give him some credit there. Obviously, Bateman's somebody that, as NFL fans, we've maybe been waiting on for a good while, and we really haven't seen that. But if he could emerge, I mean, he's still a young player overall, Bateman is. So I'm not entirely ruling it out, the idea either that somebody who is still 24 years old has a couple different levels to continue to evolve with. But I do feel like, ultimately more of those targets are going to be going to the tight ends than Bateman getting a significantly increased role. But I did just mention Justice Hill. We talked about Derrick Henry earlier. I would also keep an eye out on Justice Hill. Ultimately, depends on if you're in a PPR league or not, but if you are in points per reception, I mean, Justice Hill could emerge into a sneaky weapon to sort of at least have on the bench if anything were to happen to Derrick Henry as well. Not a bad handicap if you have him in a league, somebody to maybe keep an eye on. But I want to look at the Chiefs side of this as well, and the fact that I don't want to overreact to just one game, but Rashee Rice seems like he might actually emerge to be one of the best fantasy wide receivers in the NFL this season. And I know that does sound like a little bit of an overreaction, but when you're playing with Patrick Mahomes, you have to understand there are going to be chances to be had. The issue was last season, nobody took advantage of it really. Outside of Travis Kelce, of course, but so many issues in that overall situation with the Chiefs receiving core that now Rice seems like somebody Mahomes definitely trusts. I mean, if that weren't at least obvious from the heavy number of targets that he got from Mahomes in this game, ultimately 9 targets, 7 receptions, 103 yards. I do think that that's something that we could seriously see Rice do at least somewhat semi-consistently. We talked about this in the first segment. He was 86, I believe it was, yards per game from week 11 and on last season. So I think that I'm definitely high on that. Xavier Worthy could absolutely end up being a star for the Chiefs. I have reservations about him being a must start in fantasy football every single week. 3 touches. Now, obviously, he ends up having a huge scoring output because he scores touchdowns on 2 of them, and he's probably going to find the end zone a good amount this season. But that being said, I think it's going to be pretty reliant on explosive plays. If Marlon Humphrey plays him better on that receiving touchdown, you're looking at, half of the production, essentially, because all of his points, for the most part, came off of touchdowns that I do feel like I'm not really ready to fully commit to him as a full-time fantasy football starter, but somebody that, as a flex option, as a spot start, could definitely give you a ton of upside for fantasy football. And then the last name that we just got to get to really quickly is Travis Kelce here, where last night was quiet for him. I talked about this yesterday. I think that the Chiefs are probably during the regular season going to try and involve more of their other weapons to at least give Kelce maybe a little bit more rest as he's, getting up there in age and is coming off of multiple deep playoff runs where he was doing everything for the Chiefs. I think that Kelce, if you have him, you have to start him. You really don't have a choice, but I just don't think that he's going to be in that upper echelon of fantasy football tight ends. By the time we come to the playoffs, I expect him to still be a very effective player, period. But that being said, fantasy football-wise, I do hesitate a little bit with certain parts of it. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comments section on Travis Kelce and his production, or just in general with what you thought of last night and the fantasy football implications. But we're now going to be looking ahead at the rest of the week 1 slate, and I'm going to be handing out my top 5 best bets of betting against the spread for these NFL games. So we're going to be diving into that, but first we'll take a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.